host, Beth Ann.
And I welcome you today to CSC Talk Radio. It's my honor, my privilege, and my pleasure to be here with you today. I hope you had a very large and wonderful Thanksgiving weekend. It was big at my house. I hope it was at your house. We had a wonderful, wonderful time. You come back from a long weekend like that, and you're not sure where to start. But I found this article today, and it intrigued me because I think I have mentioned before that the sexual revolution that we had, free sex and all that, kind of led us to where we are with abortion. But this article is coming from the Daily Signal, and it's written by Victor Davis Hansen. I really like this guy, and I have seen him on Mark Levin, on Life, Liberty, and Levin. And I've seen him on with Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and Lou Dobbs. And I really like this guy. He's a historian. And I believe I talked about him a little bit last week. But he's talking about the 60s, radicals won the culture war. That's what he's titled this. And I want to share this with you because I think if we go back and look at our history and we see where we are now and some of the other articles and news that I'm going to share with you today, I think we can point it back to this revolution. And some things were good and some things are not good that came out of that. He says 50 years ago, the 60s revolution sought to overturn U.S. customs, traditions, ideology, and politics. The 60s radicals eventually grew older. They cut their hair and joined the establishment. Most thought their revolution was fizzled out in the early 70s without much effect as Americans returned to normal. He's got that in quotes. But maybe the 60s, not the silent majority, won out after all. The world, a half century later, looks at a lot more like 1968 and what followed than with what preceded it. In other words, we look more like the 60s than we do the 50s or the 40s. Most of the political cultural agenda from the turbulent period, both the advances and the regressions, has long been institutionalized. The military draft, for good or bad, has remained defunct. It is gone. There is greater transparency in politics, fewer smoke-filled rooms. Disabled children, once ostracized and or dismissively labeled retarded, and he's got that in quotes, are now far better integrated into society and treated more ethically and with special needs children. The rights of women, minorities, and the LGBT community are now widely accepted. Yet, he says, lifestyles have radically altered, and often not for the good. Before the late 60s, now stop and think about this and think about some of the issues that we have today. Before the late 60s, most Americans married before having children. Afterwards, not so much. One-parent households are now far more common. And I'm going to add, we have confused fatherless children. I remember, I'm going to digress here just a little bit, take sideways. We've had Ed on the air before. He's a local man here. He's also a historian. And I remember years and years ago when we still had the farm. And he'd come down and he'd hunt and he'd fish, and we all went to church together. And Ed made the comment one time, we're going to see a generation or two down the line here of children who don't know who they are because they don't have two parents. They don't have a father. The girls don't have a father showing them how a man should treat a woman. And the men don't, and the young boys don't have a father teaching them how to be men. So we're going to have a confused bunch of children who don't know who they are. And that's not to say that the women can't do the job. But that's not the way God had it made. It takes two. So let's get back to the article. He says other legacies of the 60s include couples marrying later and having fewer children. A half-century later, these social inheritances often mean prolonged adolescence. I guess they're living in mama's basement. Older parents, delayed and non-existent home ownerships, and more emphasis on leisure time than on household chores. Think about that. My mom used to make stuff up for us to do. Fashion remains the 60s influenced. There are few dress codes left today. Even billionaires now dress in jeans and T-shirts and sneakers rather than slacks and wingtips. He said wire rim glasses of the 50s are considered old people spectacles. Then they became hip, and now they are standard. The iconic drug of the 60s, marijuana, has been legalized in many states and soon may be decriminalized at the federal level. Now think about that. Most 60s movies routinely include a sort of profanity and nudity and graphic violence that was unknown in the 50s era. The big screen romance is often no longer about courtship, romance, and mystery, but lots of on-screen sex. Promiscuity and hookups were redefined in the 60s as norms. They are now, too, but with lots of ensuing psychological, social, and cultural damage. It's not good for you. Before the campus turmoil of the late 60s, he said, there were almost no studies courses in the college curriculum. The ancient idea still persisted that the university was obligated to teach philosophy, literature, languages, science, math, and the professions, along with the inductive method to use such knowledge to make sense of things. We don't seem to make sense of things these days, do we? Yet the impatient 60s threw out the disinterested notion as quaint, naive, and roadblock to utopia. Oh, yes, utopia. The campus instead became a center of deductive, progressive activism. Updated study courses now train students to think politically correctly rather than normal, rather than to logic. Other pernicious 60s ideas survived and got worse. The notion of shouting out in campus free speech zones now means shouting down those with whom students disagree. The street theater antics during the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation hearings, the violence of Antifa, and the disruptions of Black Lives Matter were all birthed in the 60s as legitimate means of obtaining supposedly noble ends. I hear the music. We're heading into a break. There's not much of this left, but I found it very interesting, maybe because I grew up on the tail end of those 60s. I remember a lot of the stories and the violence and protests in the street that were anything but peaceful. I remember the drugs. LSD was huge. We're headed into a break. We'll finish this up, and the calls are welcome at 877-895-5410. Are you a 60s product? 877-895-5410, and we will be right back.